Every morning before light, Verna Hollis fed the coyotes that had denned 50 yards from her own chicken house. A tin pail of butcher scraps set down at the edge of the south field for a bitch and 4 pups she had chosen not to trap. The men at the Sterling Co-op said she had lost her nerve, or her sense, or both. Earl Dunphy said it loudest. He stood by the scale house with a toothpick working in his teeth and told anybody buying feed that the Hollis place was running a charity kitchen for the very animals the county paid $2 a head to kill. He called her the Coyote Woman, and he made it sound like a diagnosis. By Easter of 1977, it had stuck to her the same as a cocklebur sticks to a wool sock, and half of Cheyenne County said it before they said good morning. Verna did not argue. That was the first thing people got wrong about her then and after. She was 58 years old, a widow 9 years, and she had spent every one of those years learning that an argument was just noise you made while the land kept score on its own. So she let Earl talk. She bought her cracked corn at 19 cents a pound, loaded it into the bed of a faded blue 1968 Ford, and drove the 11 miles home on a dirt section road with the windows down and the dust climbing behind her, like something following. The den was real. She had found it in March, the cut bank above the dry wash crumbling where the bitch had dug in under a root mass, 4 sets of small tracks pressed into the mud at the lip of it. The easy thing, the thing every man she knew would have done, was a snare on the trail and a rifle by the kitchen window. A coyote 50 yards from a chicken house was supposed to be a death sentence for the chickens. Everyone knew it. Earl knew it loudest. Verna had 30 hens, and she had not lost one. She had watched that den for 6 weeks before she carried out the first pail, and what she had seen was a coyote family that walked past her hens twice a day, on their route to the rabbit runs in the shelter belt, and never once turned aside. A coyote with a full belly of jackrabbit does not work for a chicken behind wire. A coyote with nothing does, so she fed them. She fed them so they would stay, and so they would hunt the thing she actually feared, which was not in her chicken house at all. What she feared was in the ground, and it was getting worse. Her late husband's father had run this same half section from 1929 to the year he died, and he had kept a stockman's journal in a cracked leather cover, the pages soft as cloth, the ink gone brown. Verna kept it in the kitchen drawer under the twine and the church bulletins. She read it a little at a time, the same passages over and over, until she had most of them by heart. One line she had underlined herself, years back, with a pencil pressed so hard it tore the paper. The year the rabbits come is the year the fields go. Watch the brush for who is missing. She had been watching the brush, and what was missing all across the county that spring was the thing that ate rabbits. The state had been paying bounties for 4 years, $2 a coyote, $1 a pair of ears, and the men had been collecting. Earl Dunphy had a fence post by his machine shed with the dried ears nailed to it like a tally, and he counted them out loud when he'd had a beer. 41. He was proud of 41. He believed he had made his quarter section safer. Verna looked at that post once, the spring of 77, and felt something go cold and certain in her chest, because 41 coyotes gone from one man's ground meant 41 bellies' worth of rabbits left alive to breed, and a jackrabbit doe can throw 4 litters in a summer. The arithmetic was the kind nobody at the co-op wanted to hear. She did it anyway, on the back of a feed receipt, sitting in the Ford in the co-op lot. while Earl told the scale house crowd she'd gone soft. One doe, 4 litters, 6 kits a litter. The kits breeding by August. She ran it out 3 generations and stopped, because the number stopped meaning anything past that point. It just became a word. Plague. If you've ever watched somebody steady and decent get laughed at for knowing something the loud people did not, and quietly hoped the land itself would settle the account, then you already understand why this channel exists, and you belong here with the rest of us who would rather watch the truth come up slow than hear it shouted. Take a second to subscribe and stay close, because the part where the whole county finds out what one widow already knew is the part worth waiting for. If she was right, the rabbits would come for the wheat and the alfalfa and the young corn, and they would come in a wave, and the men who had nailed their predators to a post would stand in stripped fields in July, wondering what they had done. If she was wrong, she was just a widow feeding varmints, and Earl was right to laugh. There was no third answer. She would not know for months. That was the part that kept her up at night, not the mockery, which was nothing, but the waiting to find out whether 30 years of watching had taught her anything true. So she kept feeding the den, and she kept her mouth shut, and she let the county call her the Coyote Woman through the lengthening days of May. She had learned the watching from the journal and from the old man before he died, but mostly she had learned it from the land itself, one slow lesson at a time. 30 years on the same half-section teaches you what a right April sounds like and what a wrong one sounds like. And the spring of '77 sounded wrong from the first warm night. Too quiet in the shelter belt, where the great horned owls should have been calling and were not. Too much movement low in the grass at dusk, a brown rippling along the fence lines that a careless eye would slide right past. Verna did not slide past it. She had stopped being careless the year her husband died, and the place became hers to lose. Her husband had been Harlan Hollis, dead at 50 of a heart that quit him in the seat of a tractor in the spring of 1968. He had been a good man and a poor listener, and he had farmed by the same lights as every neighbor he had, by the almanac and the elevator man and whatever the other fellows were doing that year. It was Harlan's father, old Aldous Hollis, who had farmed by the brush. Aldous had come through the dust years on this exact ground and not lost the place when half the county blew away to Oregon. And the difference, he always said, was that he farmed what the land was doing and not what he wished it would do. Verna had married into the family at 22 and listened to the old man on the porch for the 11 years before he passed, and she had been the only one of them who wrote it down. The journal was half his hand and half her own. Aldous had told her the rabbit story once, the whole of it, on a winter evening in 1956 with his pipe gone cold in his hand. He had seen it twice in his life. Once in 1890-something, a boy on his own father's place, when the jackrabbits came so thick the men held drives and clubbed them by the thousand and still lost the wheat. And once in the dry years of the 30s, when somebody talked the whole township into poisoning the coyotes off, and the rabbits answered the next summer, like the land had been waiting for the invitation. Both times, he said, the warning had been the same, and nobody had read it. The brush goes quiet. The owls move off. The hawks thin out. And then one April, you notice there are rabbits where there were never rabbits, sitting up bold in the daylight, and by then the clock has already started, and there is not a thing on God's earth you can do but watch and learn for next time. The only people who came through, Aldous said, were the ones who had left their varmints alone. He had written it in the journal in his crabbed hand, and Verna had read it so many times the page fell open to it on its own. So when she found the den in the cut bank that March, she was not looking at a coyote. She was looking at the one thing standing between her and the summer Aldous had described twice. The county saw a predator at her hen house. Verna saw a line of defense the state was paying men $2 a head to tear down. The coyote bitch grew used to her. Not Tame. Verna would not have wanted Tame, and Tame would have gotten the animal shot the first time it trusted the wrong man. But used to the shape of her in the gray light and the rattle of the pail. The bitch lay up on the cut bank with her chin on her paws and watched Verna set the scraps and walk off, and only came down when the woman was 100 yards gone. The 4 pups grew through May, leggy and ridiculous, learning to hunt in the shelter belt under their mother. Verna watched them take their first rabbits. She watched and she counted, and every rabbit those pups killed was one she subtracted from the number on the back of the feed receipt. There was a science to the feeding, though she would never have called it that. She put out enough to take the edge off a hungry animal, and not one scrap more, because a coyote fed full quits hunting, and a coyote fed lean hunts harder, and the whole point was the hunting. She measured it by eye against the size of the litter and the warmth of the morning, a double handful when the nights were cold and the pups were small, less than that as June came on and the young ones started bringing in their own kills. She put it at the wash and not the hen house, so the animals learned the food came from the far edge of the place and the hens were only hens. She did it before light, when no neighbor was on the road to see, and no man with a rifle and a bounty itch was likely to be parked at her gate. She walked the same line out and back every morning, boots through the wet stubble, the pail swinging empty on the return, so that even her own scent laid a road the animals could read, and the hens behind their wire learned the sound of her going as a thing that meant safety, and not the fox in the dark. She had thought all of it through across 6 weeks of watching before the first pail ever left her hand, and that was the part Earl Dunphy never once imagined, that the coyote woman had a reason for every single thing she did, and that the reason was older than he was, the scraps themselves. She got cheap from Renner's Locker plant in town, the trim and bone and offal that would otherwise have gone to the rendering truck, a 5-gallon bucket for $1, when she remembered to bring the man a dozen eggs. So the whole defense of her half-section ran her something like $4 a month and a half hour before dawn, against the $9,000 Tom Vasek would lose by August. She kept the figures in her head, plain as a grocery list, and never wrote them where a man might find them and laugh. $4 a month to keep a coyote family fat enough to stay and lean enough to hunt. It was the cheapest insurance in Cheyenne County, and the only kind nobody would sell you, because you could not buy it. You could only refuse to do the one thing everyone told you to do. She also moved her hens. Not far. She ran a single strand of electric wire low around the chicken yard that spring, the same wire Aldous had used in his day, charged off a fence box that ticked in the dark, and she shut the birds in tight at dusk. A coyote that has learned the hen house means a sting on the nose and a wall of wire, and that has rabbits running easy 50 yards off makes the choice any creature makes. The men at the co-op thought she was feeding predators and preying, She was running a system, every piece of it earned off a dead man's porch, and not one of them thought to ask her how it worked. Earl found out she was feeding them by hand, and it gave him a month of material. He told it at the Sterling Cafe, and he told it at church, and he told it to the county extension man who came through in June, a young fellow named Daniel Krause from the Land Grant College up at Lincoln, out doing a survey on rangeland and pests. Earl pointed Krause toward the Hollis place like he was pointing out a sideshow. "Go see the Coyote woman," he said. "She'll tell you the varmints are her friends." Daniel Krause drove out. Verna gave him coffee and did not tell him the Coyotes were her friends, because they were not, and she did not deal in that kind of sentiment. She told him about the bounty post at Dunphy's. She told him about the brush going quiet. She showed him the line in the old man's journal. "The year the rabbits come is the year the fields go." And she watched the young man read it twice and go still. He had been counting jackrabbit pellet groups along 40 miles of section road for 2 weeks, and his numbers, he admitted, were higher than anything in the literature for the region. Higher than the Dust Bowl records. He had not yet connected it to the bounties. Nobody had told him to. He asked if he could come back. She said the coffee would be on. He asked, careful, whether he could write any of it down, and she said he could write whatever was true, and then she asked him not to use her name, because a woman who tells men a thing they do not want to hear gets remembered for the telling, and not the truth. He wrote her in his notes as Cooperator H. She learned later he kept it that way through the whole report. In the first week of June, Verna nearly lost her nerve. One of the pups, the smallest, a runt with a torn ear, slipped under the chicken house wire at dawn while she was carrying the pail, and for one long second she stood frozen, certain she had been wrong about all of it, certain she was about to watch the whole theory die in a flurry of feathers with her own hens paying for her stubbornness. But the runt only nosed the spilled corn under the feeder, found a dead mouse in the chaff, and trotted back out the way it came. The hens never left the roost. Verna stood with her heart going hard and made herself breathe slow, and she understood she had just watched the thing she believed get tested in the smallest possible way and hold. It did not make her certain. It made her able to keep going, which on that morning was the most she could ask. June turned dry, and the rabbits turned bold. They came out of the brush in the daylight now, sitting up in the alfalfa in numbers that made the field look as if it were breathing. The first man to lose a corner was Tom Vasek, whose place ran along the north edge of Verna's. He came out one morning to a 40-foot strip of his young corn eaten down to the dirt. The stalks gnawed off clean at the crown, and he stood in it the same as a man stands at a graveside. He drove to the co-op and told it, and Earl said it was a bad patch, an edge thing, nothing little poison wouldn't cure. And he sold Tom on a bag of strychnine bait and a renewed faith that the problem was small. The problem was not small. Verna knew it was not small because along her own north fence, the fence she shared with Vasek, the rabbit stopped. There was a line you could see from the road, plain as a survey stake. On Vasek's side, stubble and dirt. On hers, alfalfa standing thick and green and untouched, because every dusk the Coyote family worked that fence line like a crew on a clock, and the rabbits had learned where the dying started. The den she had refused to destroy had become a wall the plague broke against. She did not say this to anyone. She drove past Vasek's ruined corner with her eyes on the road and felt no triumph in it, only the old cold certainty turning over, because a stripped field is a stripped field, whoever owns it. And Tom Vasek had 3 children and a note at the bank coming due in the fall. There is no winning in being right about a thing like this. There is only being right and watching the ones who laughed find out the hard way, and it is a poor cold comfort, and Verna knew that better than anybody in the county. She was not entirely alone in it. There was Mabel Ostergaard, the widow on the next section over, who had known Verna 40 years, and showed up that June with a thermos of coffee, and one question, "Are you holding up?" and a habit of showing up again the next morning regardless of the answer. There was old Walt Heindorf, who had farmed beside the Hollis place since before Harlan died, and who, alone among the men, did not laugh. He watched Verna's green field and her neighbor's brown ones, and kept his counsel and his respect. And there was Reverend Sam Brundage, who one Sunday in July read a passage about Joseph storing grain against the years of famine, and looked, while he read it, straight at the back pew where Verna sat alone, and said nothing more about it, and did not need to. They did not come to help her, exactly. There was nothing to help with. Her fields were the only green ones for miles. They came because a county is held together by the few who keep faith with a person before the land proves them right, and these 3 had kept it with Verna through 9 years of nobody else doing so. By the 4th of July the wave was general. It crossed the county the same as the Journal said it would, a brown tide moving out of the breaks and the unfarmed draws into every field that touched wild ground. The men who had cleared their coyotes were the worst hit, because they had built, without knowing it, exactly the conditions a rabbit plague needs. No predators, a dry, warm spring, and 100,000 acres of irrigated green set out like a banquet. The strychnine bait killed some rabbits, and a great many things that ate rabbits, hawks, and a neighbor's 2 dogs, and on the Dunphy place, the last coyote anybody had seen in a year, which Earl found dead by his machine shed and did not understand the meaning of. You could hear it at night now if you stood out past the yard light. A dry rustling all along the fence lines, 10,000 small bodies moving in the dark. A sound like a slow, steady rain that never fell, and now and again the wet snap of a stalk going down. Under it ran the men's answer, pickups crawling the section roads with a boy in a bed and a spotlight, and a .22, popping its shapes until the shells ran out, and the next dawn the rabbits sitting up in the same fields as if nothing had happened, because nothing had. A man with a rifle can kill rabbits all night and not make a dent in a number that breeds faster than he can shoot. The Coyote family in Verna's Wash did not work that way. They worked every dusk and every dawn without a spotlight or a shell or a single word of complaint, and the rabbits, who are stupid about a great many things, are not stupid about where the killing is, and so they went around. Up and down the county the men were learning the dear way that you cannot shoot your way out of a thing you poisoned your way into. Daniel Kraus came back in the middle of July with a clipboard and the face of a man who had seen the inside of his own mistake. His pellet counts had become crop loss numbers now. He walked Verna's north fence with her and stood at the line where the green stopped and the dirt began, and said, very quietly, that in 11 years of field work he had never seen a boundary that clean. He asked if he could photograph it. He asked if he could bring his department head out from Lincoln. He asked, last, almost embarrassed, how she had known. He had brought the numbers with him, and he laid them on the kitchen table while the coffee went cold. The bounty program had paid out on better than 3,000 coyotes across the western counties in 4 years, he said, and the literature was finally catching up to what that meant. Where the predators were gone, the rabbit densities had run to 40 and 50 an acre by midsummer. Where a coyote pair had been left to work a section, the rabbits held at 2 or 3. He had measured it himself, fence by fence, and the cleanest reading on the entire 40-mile transect was the one along the Hollis place, where a single intact family was doing the work of a poison program that had failed and a bounty program that had backfired. He said the word backfired and then looked like he wished he had not, because it was a young man's word for a thing that had cost his neighbors their year. Verna told him he could write the word. It was the true one. She had watched 4 years of men collecting $2 a head and felt the trouble building the whole time. And the only thing that had surprised her about the summer was that it had come exactly as the journal said it would, on the schedule of a thing she could not see, governed by an arithmetic older than the state of Nebraska. Krause asked if he could copy the line from the journal into his report. She let him. She would not let him copy her name, but the old man's line about the brush and the missing that she gave him gladly, because a true thing wants to travel, and she was only its keeper for a while. Verna did not give him a speech. She had no speech. She told him she had watched the brush for 30 years and read an old man's journal until the cover came apart, and that the land had been telling everybody the same thing it told her, and most of them had been too busy nailing ears to a post to listen. Then she walked him back to the kitchen and poured the coffee she had promised, and that was the closest she came all that long summer to saying she had been right. The losses ran into real money by August, and real money is what finally turns a county's head. Vasek lost most of 40 acres of corn and figured it at better than $9,000 at the elevator price, which was a year's profit gone to teeth. The Heindorf place lost a third of its alfalfa. Up and down the section roads, the men added it up the hard way, and the number for Cheyenne County, the way Krause finally wrote it, ran past $400,000 in standing crops, in a year when wheat was bringing barely $2.50 a bushel, and a bad year could take a place. The bounty had cost $2 a coyote. The men were learning late what the second number was. And along the Hollis south fence, the coyote family fed and the rabbits died, and Verna's field stood green into the dust of late summer like an argument nobody could shout down. People drove the section road slow now to look at it. They had driven slow before to laugh. It was the same road and the same slow driving, and only the reason had changed, and Verna noticed the difference and said nothing, because saying something would have made it about her, and it had never been about her. It was about the brush, and who was missing from it, and a line in a dead man's hand. The reckoning came at the co-op, because that was where it had started. It was a Saturday in the first week of September, the lot full of trucks, the scale house busy. Verna came in for cracked corn the same as every week. Earl Dunphy was by the scale house, but he was not telling stories now. He had lost the better part of his own wheat to the rabbits coming off the draw behind his place, the very ground he had cleared of coyotes. And a man cannot nail ears to a post and lose his crop to rabbits in the same year and keep on calling a widow soft. The crowd that used to laugh with him had gone quiet around him He watched her load her feed. She did not look at him. She was not going to look at him. She had decided that back in May. But Earl crossed the lot, the toothpick gone now, and stood in front of her with his hat in his hands like a man at a counter who does not know what he came to buy. And in front of the whole Saturday crowd at the Sterling Co-op, he said the thing that cost him the most to say. "I burned the post," he said. "The one with the ears, I burned it last week." Verna looked at him then. She did not gloat. There was nothing in her face but the same steadiness that had been there in March when he started calling her the Coyote woman. And that steadiness was harder for Earl to stand than any words would have been. "You were feeding them so they'd stay," he said. "We thought you'd gone soft." And then lower, so only she and the two nearest men could hear it. "I lost 40 acres. You didn't lose a row?" She told him the truth, which was the only thing she had ever offered him. "I lost the same as you did," she said. "I lost 9 years of nobody listening." She picked up her sack of corn, and she gave him one nod. The nod you give a man who has finally come to the right answer the long way round, and she walked to the ford. Behind her, the Saturday crowd was as quiet as the September lot, and Earl Dunphy stood holding his hat. And that was the apology and the whole of it. She did not need more. She had never needed more. Daniel Krause's report came out that winter through the Extension Service, and it changed how the bounty was talked about in 3 counties, and it never used her name. Cooperator H, it said. The single intact predator population in the survey area, it said, with the lowest recorded crop loss. Men who would not take advice from a widow took it from a mimeographed bulletin out of Lincoln, which suited Verna fine, because the point was never that they should listen to her. The point was that they should listen to the land, and the bulletin was only the land saying it in a voice the men were willing to hear. The coyote pups were grown by fall, and 3 of them dispersed like young coyotes do, off across the section roads to find ground of their own, and Verna had to remind herself she was glad of it. The bitch stayed, and denned again the next March in the same cut bank, and Verna carried the pail out again before light, and by then nobody in the county called it charity. A few of them quietly started leaving a little something out at their own field edges. They did not call it feeding the coyotes. They called it what Earl had finally called it that day in the lot, letting them stay. The words mattered less than the doing. She read the journal less after that summer, not because she had outgrown it, but because she had finally caught up to it. The old man had written what he knew, and then he had died, and left it in a drawer for whoever came after, trusting that someone would read it slow enough to believe it. She had been that someone. She thought sometimes about who would be the someone after her, and she started that winter adding her own lines in the back of the same cracked leather cover in pencil pressed hard. "The summer the rabbits came," she wrote. "The summer the county learned to count past $2. On the last warm evening of that fall, she walked the south fence at dusk, the light going long and copper across the stubble, the first stars coming up over the shelter belt. Down in the wash, the coyote bitch came out to hunt, gray and unhurried, and stood a moment at the lip of the cut bank, looking up at the woman as she had looked up every gray morning since March, and then turned and slipped into the brush after the rabbits. Verna stood at her fence until the cold came up out of the ground. Tom Vasek had replanted his corner. Daniel Kraus had written to say he was coming back in spring. The Heindorfs had set a pail at their own field edge. Mabel Ostergaard had it figured Verna would never say a word about being right, and was glad of her for it. Verna took the journal out of her coat pocket, where she had carried it down to the fence, and held it a moment in the last of the light, the leather soft as cloth, the old man's brown ink and her own gray pencil sharing the same page now. She did not open it. She knew the line by heart. The year the rabbits come is the year the fields go. Watch the brush for who is missing. The county had finally watched the brush. It had cost them $400,000 to learn the watching, and it had cost Verna 9 years of being the Coyote woman. And standing at the fence in the cold, she could not have told you which price was steeper. The land kept its own ledger. It always had. She slid the journal back into her coat and walked up the dark slope toward the kitchen light, unhurried. And behind her in the wash, the rabbits ran, and something gray and patient ran them down. Some knowledge cannot be argued into a person. It can only be waded into them, one ruined harvest at a time, until the land says out loud what one quiet woman knew all along. So here is the question I will leave you with, and it is the same one Cheyenne County had to answer the hard way that summer of '77. If everyone you trusted told you to kill the thing 50 yards from your hen house, and only the land and one old journal told you to feed it, would you have trusted the county, or would you have trusted the brush?